Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the Illinois Environmental Council for our Sustainable Transportation Town Hall. My name is Danny Robles. I am IEC's Legislative Relations Director, and I am thrilled to be your host tonight. As folks join the line, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. By way of introductions, I'd love to know who's on the line, so please add your name, pronouns, and where in Illinois you are zooming in from in the chat. Um, and all attendees are muted by default. Uh, Please, if you have any questions, use the chat function to ask questions, add comments, provide resources to information that you might be sharing with us. We will take live questions at the end of the session. I will be trying to capture any questions that are asked in the chat and making sure that we reserve those for the end to make sure that all the questions that get asked are answered. And finally, I think this should go without saying, please keep tonight's conversation civil and cordial. This is an educational event to learn more about sustainable transportation, our legislative work here at IEC that we're planning for 2026. Any profanity and personal attacks or disruptive behavior will not be tolerated. And please don't make me or our comms team remove you from the Zoom line. Now, before we get started, I'd like to ground us in the work and why we are doing this. Um, as you all know, IEC has been around for 50 years. We just celebrated our 50-year anniversary, and in that time frame, we have worked to safeguard Illinois, our people, our plants, animals, and the natural system in which we all depend on by building power for people and the environment. We represent over 125 organizations operating across Illinois, and we carry our mission to advance public policies that create a healthy environment across Illinois through education, advocacy, and movement building. Now, tonight we are going to be hearing a little bit more about transportation legislation, and we are coming off a very historic session for public transit here in Illinois. We passed SB 2111, the Northern Illinois Transit Authority Act, and tonight we might not explore too much about what is in that act. Would love to welcome y'all to come to another night, but we are going to be discussing why we're going to continue driving important legislation. We know that climate pollution is a number one source of increased damages that are causing a lot of harm to our environment, our society. And here in Illinois, the transportation sector continues to be one of the number one source of carbon emissions that is contributing to this um, harm. A lot of this is also affecting a lot of our communities. We are seeing that the diesel pollution is creating a lot of harmful effects that are hurting people's pulmonary and cardiovascular um, health. And we know that there's multiple counties here in Illinois that are the most impacted, and we're looking to address those issues through long-term transportation challenges. Other things that we are continuing to drive is that we know that that our system, our society has been long dependent on car dependency, and we have created roads that are super expansive for cars, but that they're not collaborative to bring active modes of transportation and other sources of public transit that will help eliminate greenhouse gas emissions in the transportation sector. And those are things that we're going to continue to tackle. And then finally, we are facing some deep federal challenges, causing concerns on how fast we can transition towards zero emission vehicle infrastructure here in Illinois. And how we do this work collaboratively will really help us drive messages forward. So at the federal level, this past year, we've seen reductions in the Inflation Reduction Act on tax incentives to zero emission vehicles that are slowing down the progress. We've also seen the reconsideration of the greenhouse gas endangerment finding that a lot of the US EPA has used to make sure that we're fighting against polluters in Illinois and across the country. And more importantly, we're also seeing rollbacks on clean vehicle standards. The US EPA had adopted cleaner vehicle standards in the Biden administration, and lately, this past administration has really reduced that. So these are some of the challenges that we're facing and feeling as we are continuing to drive policies in Illinois. And to help us understand and get settled in how we're going to tackle these issues, I want to introduce someone who has been very key component in making sure that we are supporting sustainable transportation in Illinois. From the Illinois House of Representatives, she was has been a strong supporter for IEC in making sure that we're driving um, equitable policies, especially here in transportation. Having been appointed to the Regional Transportation Board of Directors before her time in the legislature, she was firsthand witness in the effectiveness or the ineffectiveness of the separate transit agencies and how they worked against each other. And she was instrumental this past year in the House Working Group that deliberated the Northern Illinois Transit Authority Act to ensure that suburban voices and experiences were heard, and bringing her perspective on why strengthening public transportation is a key component to not only building resilience for our communities, but developing climate smart transportation options for Illinois. She's steadily becoming a strong partner for the environmental community and supporting legislation that focuses on social justice, supporting families in Illinois, and bringing transportation reforms. Having received 100% from IC scorecard in each year that she's been in the General Assembly, it is my privilege to introduce our keynote speaker tonight, Representative Mary Beth Canty.
Thank you so much, Danny. And thank you to everybody who's here with us tonight and to IEC. I want to start, I know we're not going to get into the nitty gritty of the bill that we just passed, but I have to tell you, it is one of our crowning achievements and work that I am incredibly proud of. When I first moved to Illinois in 2008, I knew we were moving to Chicago. That's what my husband and I had talked about. And I said, I'm going to get rid of my car because we're going to the big city. And I was moving here from Las Vegas. And I said, I'm not going to have a car, and this is going to be so great. We're going to live so close to the train. And my husband said, why don't you keep your car for 6 months and see how that works out? And here we are in 2025. I still have a car because I live in beautiful Arlington Heights, Illinois. And I've always lived in Arlington Heights, Illinois since 2008. And transit doesn't work the same in the suburbs as it does in our larger metropolises. And it's because we've created a system that is designed around bringing people from the suburbs into the city and out of the city and moving them around once they leave the city of Chicago. And so when I joined the RTA Board of Directors, I thought, this is my opportunity. This is my chance to start expanding transit, and I may get to live my dream of not having to drive myself everywhere, and realized very quickly that that was not to be. The RTA, as it currently exists, was really just ineffective at making changes to our system. So to be able to change the way that we view transit, the way that we govern transit, the way that we fund transit is monumental. And I think we should all be really, really proud of that work. Separately and not unrelatedly, I am carrying a bill, the Transportation Choices Act. And one of the things that we had talked about roughly 2 years ago when we were bringing this bill forward was that we wanted to be working on these things together. But if we had to separate them, we needed the overall transportation bill to go first. We needed that structural integrity to show people that transit is meaningful and that it is not just a smart environmental policy. It is not just smart social policy, but it is smart fiscal policy. And now we've been able to achieve that. And I think what you'll see coming into this spring is an expansion of that work. Right. And so as we're looking to actually make meaningful changes to our greenhouse gas emissions, to doing community investment in some of the areas, particularly in the south suburbs and the south side of Chicago, where they have been environmentally disadvantaged for far too long, we're going to start to see some shifts. And folks looking at these policies that we tend to think of as, they like to bill us as what, tree huggers, right? That's still a thing. We're these super sensitive types, but these are really fiscally sound policies. When we are making sure that our environment is taken care of, we are starting to cut down on health ramifications. We start to drive development in areas that desperately need it, which starts to help provide relief from a property tax perspective for folks who live in those areas. So these things are all interconnected. It's not either or. It's not, are you a sensitive, bleeding heart who can't be practical, or are you a, mustache twirling, business type? These are things that we need to be looking at seriously and together for both the social and environmental aspect and the fiscal aspect as well. And I think we're starting to show that work. We're starting to show it together, and we're really starting to make a difference across our entire state and really leading the charge nationwide on some of these policies. And I think, especially with the creation of the NEDA board and the way that we've been able to solve our fiscal crisis, I think we're going to see other states look to us as a model of what can be done when we force people to the table. And that doesn't mean we got everything that we wanted. I will be the first to admit I wish we had been able to go a little bit further in some areas, but lawmaking is also a little bit of compromise. And I think that's what we also bring to the table, are these smart approaches to policy that says, how far can we go to advance what we need to do and still bring everybody along with us and not lose it in the future. And I think that's what we've done, and that's what we're going to continue to see in the spring and future sessions. So I'm really excited about doing that work and working with you all. So thank you for having me tonight.
Well, thank you for your leadership, Rep. Canty, and we're really excited to have you down in Springfield and also in the north suburbs to continue driving um, great messages and policies that will help us clean up our transportation system, but also think about the long-term livability for community members across Illinois.
That's right. This place is far going to outlast us if we take care of it. So we can do that together.
100%. Um, And now it's my privilege to also introduce you to our transportation town hall presenters who will be talking a bit about our transportation policies that we are going to be prioritizing in 2026. From the Natural Resources Defense Council, we have Muhammed Patel. Muhammed is senior transportation advocate, and he works very closely with NRDC's Midwest Climate Energy Team to advance policies and programs and standards that help reduce emissions from the transportation sector. Muhammad is also responsible for engaging with state-level clean vehicle policies to equitably transition the Midwest to zero-emission vehicles, working on policies to accelerate EV charging infrastructure deployment, and advocating for programs to shift transportation investments to multimodal mobility options. Prior to joining NRC, Muhammad received a bachelor's degree in environmental engineering from Northwestern University and worked as a consultant for state and local governments on transportation policy, including workforce development, program and project funding, and strategies to building equitable transportation infrastructure. And we're lucky to have Muhammad as a leader in the Clean Jobs Coalition. Joining Muhammad, we also have Dave Simmons, who is Executive Director of Ride Illinois. Dave is a longtime advocate for bike advocacy. He became a league certified instructor through the League of American Bicyclists in 2009. And as an LCI, he has taught dozens of smart cycling classes in addition to introducing children and adults to the wonders of cycling by teaching them how to ride a bike. Dave led the creation of the Friends of Cycling in Elk Grove Village and has served as the advocacy group's president since 2012. And recently he led the effort to launch Illinois' first bike walk summit in Springfield this past May, where hundreds of advocates discussed creating a more connected, livable, and thriving communities through dialogue, lobby sessions, and ride-alongs in our capital. And rounding this out tonight, we also have Tarik Shahzad, who's a government affairs associate with the Nature Conservancy. Tarik works for the Illinois chapter here on external advocacy and policy initiatives. And as a member of the chapter's government relations team, he spends time advocating for climate and conservation policy in Springfield and in Chicago. On state climate policy, Tarik explores opportunities for clean transportation advocacy, emerging energy technology, policy development, and supporting the clean energy transition initiatives. Since joining TNC in 2023, Tarik's climate work has included issues such as carbon capture, zero emission vehicle adoption, city level transportation funding, and renewable energy deployment. Prior to joining TNC, Tarik received a bachelor's degree in environmental policy from Middlebury College and worked in nonpartisan political advocacy as well as on-the-ground ecological restoration in Chicago's southeast side. He's based out of Chicago office, and regular can be found birdwatching along Chicago's lakefront or taking the Amtrak to Springfield during spring legislative session. And if y'all have questions on bird watching, I definitely recommend reaching out to Tarik for information. But without further ado, I would love to turn it over to our presenters, and I'm going to start us off with Muhammad to talk a little bit about our legislative priorities, the Transportation Choices Act.
Thank you, Danny, and hi, everyone. Thanks for being here on this evening. As Danny mentioned, my name is Muhammed Patel. I work for the Natural Resource Defense Council. I am one of those policy nerds that gets to do this work a lot. So if I use any acronyms or things that folks are familiar with, please feel free to ask questions in the chat or ask me to slow down. But at the highest level, what is the problem that we're trying to solve for? And it's that having access to only one mode of transportation is inherently limiting in a variety of ways. Car ownership and use is expensive. Recently, it was noted this year that the average cost of a new vehicle in the United States is over $50,000. That's just unaffordable. And the average cost for maintaining a vehicle in Illinois annually is over $14,000 in annual household costs. So it's a significant driver of one of the biggest crises of today outside of the climate crisis, which is the affordability crisis. But there are a ton of negative externalities that come with more cars on the road. Like Rep. Canty mentioned, not being able to live a life without a car means a variety of things. You're sitting in traffic all the time. Traffic leads to tons of tailpipe pollution that lead to asthma, lung disease, heart disease in communities all across the state. And if you don't have reliable access to another option, you're going to be forced to use that mode over and over again. And that lack of other options could be in the form of wanting public transit in your community that you might just not have access to. In the case, as Representative Canty mentioned, of the system that we have being very much between Chicago and the suburbs rather than intra-suburb or other types of travel around the state. And also just something we hear all the time is a lack of safe walking and biking. I would love to walk to the coffee shop, but there's no sidewalk in my community. So how am I supposed to get there? I'm going to have to drive. And that's a huge part of this. So just some quick facts for you on that right-hand side. And I think Danny's going to send out these slides, so I won't belabor them. But I think what they show is that we are, in Illinois, overly dependent on cars. They contribute heavily to our air quality issues that we face in the state. And they limit our livelihoods across the board. Whether or not we're sharing cars, whether or not we are people with disabilities that can't drive, whether or not we have elderly relatives or young relatives who can't drive themselves, all of these are extremely limiting factors to our daily lives. So what does that mean, right? In the world that we see around us, the infrastructure is vast. We see roads all the time, and billions of dollars go into that system. So how does that work? And Danny, if you want to go to the next slide, I made hopefully a quick and dirty graphic here in PowerPoint to explain that. But it is a cycle, right? And it's a non-virtuous negative feedback loop where we have no options other than driving. So everyone drives. That means more traffic and more cars in general. Well, if there are more cars and more people are driving, then that tells the investors in the state and the Department of Transportation, for example, that we need to spend the money that we have to expand and maintain all of these roadways that people are using. But there's a limited amount of funding. So that means less money for non-car modes. And then what does that mean? There's no options other than driving. And we're stuck in this cycle where we're being forced to put billions of dollars every few years into a system and maintain a system in perpetuity that's not really serving us and the society that we want to see. So Representative Canty mentioned the Transportation Choices Act as a way to begin to advance these goals of creating more options to get around the state of Illinois. But Danny, if you want to go to the next slide, it's important to say, why now, right? I think there are a couple of reasons, and Representative Canty touched on this, which is passage of this new transit legislation is going to be integral to us maximizing this opportunity. So we will have a system that functions reliably, safely, and frequently, that it can even take more ridership. A big part of this is that people in Illinois, across the board, downstate, upstate, in the center of the state, all want more transportation options. The three highest things, and this is a survey on the right from the Illinois Department of Transportation last year, that said the three things that people want most to see out of their investments in transportation are better, so repaired highways and bridges, more mass transit and public transportation systems, and then upgraded bike and pedestrian paths. Then after that is expanded roadways. So even from the get-go, we're seeing that people actually want these. And I didn't put this graphic up here, but I'll just speak to it for a second. There's a huge climate imperative here. If we look at the amount of emissions that we are going to need to reduce from our transportation system, as Danny mentioned, the highest polluting sector in Illinois, in order to not raise the global temperature above 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5 degrees Celsius, we're going to need significant amounts of people using other modes. About 20% of all trips need to be with other modes, in addition to the fact that we need widespread adoption of EVs. So you'll hear a lot in this climate movement that EVs are the only way for us to solve the emissions issues of the transportation system. And while they do serve an integral role and we will need wide-scale adoption of EVs, the challenges currently at the federal level make the near-term possibilities of that expansion really benefiting us slim. So what can we do instead? Get people off the road, get people into healthier, cleaner modes of transportation like mass transit, biking, and walking. And that can cause significant reductions in emissions. So where does that leave us? Jenny, if we can go to the next slide. The Transportation Choices Act, right? What's the goal? We want to provide people in this state with more choices so that we can live a better life with less time spent in cars. And what does less time spent in cars mean? It means less GHG and criteria pollutant emissions. So things that are actively harming our planet and public health. It means less crashes. People spend a lot of time in cars, and it's the most dangerous thing you can do on a daily basis. If we provide other safer routes for people to get around, then we can save lives. The improvements in air quality are amazing. And then the cost savings. Like I mentioned, owning a car and paying for a car is super expensive. The more we can have people use other modes, own fewer cars, can actually contribute significantly to household savings. And then overall healthy living. So what does this bill do? At the highest level, what it's doing is over the next 20, 30 years, as we look to our long-term, as well as medium and short-term planning for the billions of dollars that we have to invest in our transportation system, let's align those investments and the goals of those investments with our goals to reduce transportation emissions. So what does that mean? Instead of expanding roadways endlessly that we're going to have to take care of the next 100 years and that are contributing to the climate crisis by taking away green spaces, by just adding more lanes and more emissions, what can we do instead? Let's invest in biking, walking, transit, EV charging, public green spaces, reclaiming those roadways so that we can create more heat sinks so that people aren't suffering so badly from the heat islands that come from massive roadways and neighborhoods, right? It's all going to fit into a much larger framework of we're investing a lot of money in the system. Why don't we make it a system that we all want to use and that doesn't force us to own cars to get around? Because I think a lot of people can speak to this who live outside the city of Chicago. As Rep. Canty mentioned, it's really hard to get around without a car in a lot of places in the state. So what we want to do is make that a little bit easier. And before I pass it along, I just saw a question in the chat, and I'll just say 20% is not the magic number for transit trips. 20% or 25%, depending on what you want to do, is the magic number for shifting away from car trips. So we want to reduce the amount of vehicle miles that we're using in the whole state by about 20%. And that's going to massively improve our climate outcomes. And I will end there. And please feel free to put questions in the chat, and I know we're going to do Q&A afterwards.
Thank you so much, Muhammad. And I think this is the perfect segue to discuss like what are other items that we need to think about to ensure that we have a transition to active modes of transportation. And I think no one has probably ridden more miles in their bike in Illinois than Dave Simmons. So I'll pass it over to you. I'm making that assumption. So
Yeah, probably not. But I did attend a meeting in Vernon Hills last night, which was, a pretty lengthy bike ride from Elk Grove Village, and so I'm happy to be sitting home today for this meeting. Yeah, thanks, Danny, and thanks, Muhammad. And it is Danny mentioned, I'm executive director of Right Illinois. We are your nonprofit bike advocacy organization, and our mission is to make Illinois better through biking. And we are proud IEC members. I really have learned a lot from IEC. I have personally, our organization has as well. So I appreciate this opportunity to chime in tonight. I wanted to start, and this is not in the presentation, Danny, but it's a quote that we just learned of in the last 24 hours from Representative Sam Graves from Missouri, who is the chair of the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure. And he was talking about the next federal transportation reauthorization bill. And here's his quote. I'm going to do my air quotes here. He said, "It's going to be a traditional highway bill. That means building roads and bridges, laying asphalt, pouring concrete. We're not going to be spending money on murals and train stations or bike paths or walking paths. We're going to spend money on traditional infrastructure. That's roads and bridges." Can't make this stuff up sometimes. So that's for the next federal transportation bill, something that we'll have to be pushing back against. But tonight I wanted to talk about two initiatives, one of which was a bill in the spring 2025 session that's going to help us achieve what Muhammad discussed with mode shift and reducing carbon emissions. The first one, and I think, we're on the right one. So yeah, recognizing bicyclists as permitted and intended road users, which is not currently the case in Illinois. So there was a bill, HB 2454 that was introduced last year. But currently in Illinois, bicyclists can only, and as the slide says, receive legal redress if they are injured in a facility that is intended for bicyclists. Meaning if a bicyclist crashes because there's a giant pothole, but that pothole is not in a bike lane, they're kind of out of luck. It's an oversight. It's tied to the Tort Immunity Act in Illinois. And it's worth noting that Illinois is the only state in the country that views bicyclists as permitted but not intended users of public roadways, unless that signage is there or it's bike infrastructure. To give you a sense of like kind of what that means, or the way that I equate it in my head is, a wheelchair ramp leading up to a building. That is intended for folks who use wheelchairs, but I, as an able-bodied person, am permitted to use it. So it's a distinction between permitted and intended. The bill that I mentioned, HB 2454, but it would eliminate that restriction that bicyclists are currently running up against if they crash and have serious bodily injury. So it would recognize roads in Illinois and not interstates. It's your typical roads. Limited access highways doesn't apply there, but it would recognize bicyclists as permitted and intended users. One of the outcomes of the current law that's in place is that we found that municipalities are just resistant to even develop a bike infrastructure, because once they do so, they are opening themselves up, in theory, to potential legislation or liability if someone is seriously injured. This has not been an issue in 49 other states. Municipalities are not going bankrupt because bicyclists are suing them willy-nilly for all the crashes that happen on their roads. So it seems more of a overreaction than a reality. So what the bill that was introduced last spring would do is restore the Illinois municipality's duty to protect bicyclists by maintaining the roads. And it does so while protecting municipalities from unjustified claims, which, again, we're not looking to make it easy for bicyclists to sue municipalities. And again, it's going to align Illinois law with every other state. So municipalities are responsible for maintaining the roads. And if a bicyclist is seriously injured because it's not maintained, that gives them some recourse. So at this point, we are going to be pursuing this again in the spring 2024 session, right? We being Ride Illinois, IAC, and partners. So we're excited to see where that goes and continue discussion to align Illinois with every other state. And next slide, Danny. There's one other topic that has not necessarily been introduced as a bill recently. It's bike walk education in schools. So some of you may be familiar with the law that bill that was signed into law in 2018, which was HB 4799. We thought it was this magical moment that now Illinois students are going to receive safe bike walk education. The bill itself simply says that the school board of a school district that basically teaches K through 8 shall adopt the policy to educate students on biking and walking. It has to make education available. There's no incentive. There's no penalties for noncompliance. And we're not aware of anyone that's tracking compliance. And so it sounds great on the surface, but the intended result has not taken place. So what we've discussed with a few state reps so far, is we're calling it strengthening bike walk education in schools. I think it's important to note that in conversation, we'll hear frequently, "Wow, kids don't ride their bikes anymore. Kids don't ride to school, this and that." And a lot of times the reason that people give is, well, they're not being taught. They don't know how to navigate their communities. So we see this as a potential solution for generational behavior change. And it's an empowering thing as well, right? If we empower kids to know how to safely navigate their communities by bike or on foot, that can go a long way towards that behavior change, the mode shift, again, that Muhammed mentioned. And the beauty of all this is the state of Minnesota they're always one step ahead of Illinois. They've developed curriculum, they've aligned it to their standards, and they've said, use it. You adopt this in Illinois. And so we shared the link to the Minnesota statute with several members of the House Education, and I can't remember the full name of the committee, but it kind of spells out what can be done here in Illinois. And Rep. Janet Yang Rohr was going to be submitting that bill to LRB to be discussed in the spring session. One other thing I'll note on this is the fact that e-devices or devices with electric motors are becoming more and more popular, kind of an explosion this summer, and that's a whole other topic we won't get into tonight. But that will be part of that's intended to be part of any education that would be shared with students in Illinois schools. So that landscape, the modes are constantly changing. We want to give Illinois students the opportunity to learn and again, empower them to move about without having to have parents drive them for every trip. So this is not a bill currently. We don't have a bill number, but it is something that Ride Illinois IEC partners will be advocating for, because we see that it's very important for future generations to be able to move about outside the motor vehicles that are polluting the air and causing damage to the planet. So that's kind of the quick summary. Again, appreciate the opportunity to share with folks tonight. I will check the chat and hang on until the end of the session in case there's other questions that come up. Pass it back to you, Danny.
Thanks so much, Dave. As y'all can see, we're definitely stacking the bills to make sure that not only are we planning our streets designs more holistically for safer transition to active modes of transportation, but also thinking about the pieces that will help us make that generational transition and making sure that we have the education available. So far we've talked a little bit about public transit. We've talked about street design and safety. But I think the other component that's going to help us reduce greenhouse gas emissions is making a transition to zero emission vehicles. And right now, with the challenges we're facing at the state level, IEC and our partners have been working closely on a bill with Senator Kaler, and I'm going to have Tarik discuss a little bit more about the low carbon fuel standards, clean transportation standard, but wanted to set the stage of like why we're going to be engaging in this effort next year to ensure that we are identifying a new pathway to bring some funding towards zero emission vehicles, but also figuring out how does this make sense for Illinois. So Tarik, I will pass it over to you.
Thank you, Danny. Good evening, everyone. Thanks to Dave and Muhammed for their great presentations. And thank you, Rep. Canty, for your leadership on the huge win with NETA, and for everyone for joining us tonight. I will be presenting a little bit about a conceptual transportation policy that we've been involved with for over a year and a half now with Senator Kaler's office. I didn't include the specific bill number in these slides because there's going to be a lot of fluctuation in the next few months. But for any policy nerds out there, you can Google search SB 41 Illinois to find the previous bill text, to find that full legislative text. And I'll be talking about a clean transportation standard. So, the other presenters talked about how we need to shift our modes of transit in order to address climate emissions in the state of Illinois, because our transportation sector is the #1 carbon emitting sector. It's the elephant in the room that we need to tackle. And inevitably, even if we can shift, a huge chunk of the Illinois population to adopt public transit and take up biking and walking and Metra and so many different more cleaner modes of transit, we will have cars on the road. And so how do we address those cars? How do we make them cleaner? One way is to incentivize more electric vehicle adoption. Another one is to address the fuels that enter those vehicles, and largely the transportation fuels in the state of Illinois. That's something that's largely overlooked when we talk about our climate emissions. The first point here is that in the state of Illinois, our fuels are contributing to our greenhouse gas portfolio. And that includes the gasoline that we put in our vehicles. So there's a really important question, and it's, can we create a program, a system, a market to transition our transportation fuel economy to being a more green one? And so on the next slide, a hypothetical program could be called a clean transportation standard. In other states, it's referred to as a low carbon fuel standard. You may have heard of that program in California, which has been running for several years now. As environmental advocates, we envision a clean transportation standard benefiting the environment specifically by reducing the sale of petroleum-based fuels, right? And transitioning us away from fossil fuel technology. Like, I think that's something that we wanted to transition away from decades ago, and we need to act urgency because the climate crisis is here now. And so a pro-environment clean transportation standard, we envision it would increase investment in low carbon fuels, and that includes clean electricity that's produced by wind and solar. And also that this sort of clean transportation standard would add funding and boost investment largely towards initiatives that clean up our air, that clean up our transportation sector's petroleum-based vehicles, accelerate them towards zero-emission vehicles. So an example of that would be money from the program funding EV charging infrastructure. So that would incentivize more EV adoption in the state of Illinois, and then more people fewer petroleum-based cars would be on the road, and we would accelerate our transition to zero-emission vehicles. So going on to the next slide. It's really important when we create this program, there's going to be a carbon intensity score that measures just how polluting a fuel type is. And so you can imagine that our petroleum-based fuels will have this most negative, the carbon intensity score that we're least happy with. And this life cycle analysis is going to take into consideration the start and finish of that fuel type. So much of our relationship with a fuel is just dispensing it into the sort of a vehicle that we need, like when we turn on our light switch or when we fill up our cars. But really, the greenhouse gas emissions from fuels start from their production and where they come from. And then there's also greenhouse gas emissions associated with their transportation to specific locations, and then their processing, or in this chart, it's labeled as blending, and then finally their end use. So there's greenhouse gas emissions that are emitted throughout the entire process, and that's why our transportation sector is just so bloated in emissions. And that's and we're gonna, in a clean transportation standard, we're gonna have a life cycle analysis that considers this entire process in which greenhouse gases are emitted for the fuel type, and then determine a score for that fuel. And so for the next slide, there's going to be this baseline score, and that baseline score is decided by us. If we're going to craft this program and this standard, it's entirely the way we decide it. You know, it's a socially constructed program. You know, there isn't a natural set of laws that decide how a clean transportation standard ought to be. But what we want really is a CI standard that is robust and specifically targeted to accelerate our transition towards clean fuel types and reducing our dependency on more polluting fuel types. So let's say we create a program, that program will have a certain CI score and a baseline. And so whatever fuel types are so polluting that they score above that baseline, then they're going to generate something called deficits. And so industries that produce these and engage with these fuel types that are most polluting above this baseline are going to be creating deficits. They're going to be incurring costs. And then folks who are creating fuel types and producing fuel types that are cleaner than the standard, the baseline that we decide, are going to produce the opposite, credits. And then eventually what we envision is a market where, on the next slide, the fuel producers, both those who generate the deficits as well as those who generate the credits, can engage in this sort of trade. The fuel producers mentioned here are some great examples where you can imagine fossil fuel producers from the outset will have such quote unquote dirty fuel types where they're going to be inherently producing deficits regardless of really the carbon intensity score we decide on, that baseline. And then you can imagine electric utility companies that are producing the electricity from solar or wind. They're going to have really clean fuel. And so they're going to be generating credits. And so the fossil fuel industry folks are going to have to be purchasing these credits to offset their deficits. Otherwise, they're going to be incurring too many costs and they won't be able to sustain their programs. Eventually, what this does in a market theory is incentivize the transition of all these industries towards more cleaner fuel types because it saves them money over time. They don't want to, if you're participating in this market, it's smarter for you, economically smarter, to produce fuels that are below this baseline, that are cleaner. And what's so great about a clean transportation standard, one of the most important points is once we decide this baseline for carbon intensity, we also want it to be getting more stringent over time. And so that what that will do is it's not going to just create this standalone baseline where folks can easily skirt it after a few years. What it will do is it's going to get more strict and squeeze out industries and fuel types that are dirty and contributing a lot of greenhouse gas emissions to our transportation sector. And it's going to, over time, phase out dirtier fuels and spur investment in cleaner fuels. And for the last slide, this was all very conceptual. And so there is a bill, and that's being deliberated right now. It has been introduced, but there's a lot of disagreement on what this market ought to look like, because really you're pulling in so many different interests into the room. So the question is, where are we with an Illinois Clean Transportation Standard? And the most important point I want to drive home here is that environmental advocates like the Nature Conservancy and Illinois Environmental Council are in the room right now negotiating what legislation should look like. And we're in that room with other environmental nonprofits, with fossil fuel interests, with electric vehicle suppliers, fuel and retail professionals, economic policy experts, farmers and growers, and corn and soybean representatives, among others. And our advocacy, generally speaking, at a high level, has been focused on supporting a strong reduction in carbon intensity for fuel types, and that means a strong baseline, and then a pathway towards reducing that baseline at an ambitious pace. Second, we want to prioritize zero emission technology, especially for vehicles, and more of that adoption. Third, a clean transportation standard could unfortunately drive land use change, the conversion of natural landscapes or farmland, productive farmland, to producing specific fuel types. And so we want to reduce the amount of land use change that could happen with the implementation of this kind of program by implementing some sort of environmental safeguards and guardrails. So that's part of what we've been advocating for, as well as incentivizing those that participate in this program to adopt conservation and climate practices into their fuel production. An example of that is incentivizing farmers and growers to implement climate smart agriculture, climate smart ag practices into their growing operations. And, for example, constructed wetlands or edge of field practices and cover crops to reduce the carbon intensity of their practices, but also those different specific practices have benefits that that are supplemental to addressing carbon emissions, that also has benefits towards wildlife and towards water quality. So this is quite a conceptual idea, and it has been implemented in other states. There are deep concerns about winners and losers, crafting a market that can stand on its own. And we're not. For example, I'm not an economist, and so I don't have the knowledge background to sort of address every single facet of this technology. But what we're doing as environmental advocates is making sure that these really important pieces, these really important principles, are being hammered in negotiations. And generally speaking, for the negotiations, I just want to apologize for being vague. The Senate sponsor has invited a lot of advocates and stakeholders into these negotiations, and there is an agreement not to divulge, specific representatives in those negotiations, nor there's also a non-attribution clause, so we're not supposed to attribute specific advocacy items towards specific organizations, but as the Nature Conservancy, I can divulge that these are the things we've been advocating for, and I don't think Danny would mind too much that I mentioned that IEC has been advocating for these things as well. So I apologize for a lot of the jargon on this topic, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Tarik. I really appreciate you walking us through a very complex policy that I think a lot of us are learning and figuring out the best way to advocate for best practices for Illinois in a way that makes sense. And this is a policy that spans multiple issue areas that IEC and multiple of our organizations work on. So as Tarik had mentioned, I think there's going to be a lot of conversations with our ag partners to continue discussing what's in this provisions. I think this is a bill that's going to continue to be negotiated next year, but it is one that we wanted to bring to light for next year as things continue moving forward, and want to provide that transparency as much as we can divulge through the negotiations. to ensure that, the community is aware of the proceedings, and inviting people to continue giving us some reflections and insights on this bill, and also the Transportation Choices Act and the Bike Walk Education material. So these are um, bills that we're prioritizing, but I think there's always room for growth and understanding. And now I'd love to turn it over. I know we only have about 8 minutes, but if you do have any additional questions, feel free to raise your hand here on Zoom. I will read some of the questions. I think most of the questions from the chat have been answered. Really thankful for our presenters. And I don't think anyone's dialing via phone, so feel free to use the raise your hand function, or write your question in the chat, and I'll be sure to call on you guys.
Danny, I've got a quick question. Will you share the deck with folks, or there are a couple links in there that are just pertain to the information that I shared? Should we pop those in the chat?
I will be sure to compile the links. This will be sent out via this will be recorded, so folks will have access to the presentation, but I will make sure that the links are also included in the follow-up email to everyone who signed up.
I have a question for Tarik. Tarik, could you talk about we hear a lot about the Trump administration's attacks on EVs overall. Could you talk about how like a clean transportation standard might be a good choice for Illinois because of where the federal landscape is?
Yes, definitely. So, unfortunately, the federal government has been rolling back a lot of our progress, a lot of the ways that it has previously helped incentivize zero emission vehicle adoption in states across the country. And so, if there isn't a strong economic incentive, because right now, consumers are struggling. Economic issues are at the forefront for folks. There needs to be strong economic incentive for folks to adopt clean vehicles. And so Illinois can lead individually as a state, but we would need to pass specific state policy to do that. And so a clean transportation standard, if crafted towards benefiting electrification, accelerating electrification, could do two things. One, it could create the groundwork, the infrastructure, and the foundation for zero emission vehicles. So there is that inherent bottleneck that if we, even if we can get, a 10-20% increase in EV ownership in Illinois just in a few years, we're lacking, for example, charging infrastructure. We're lacking fundamental infrastructure and foundations for those vehicles and for folks who own those vehicles to even manage and own them effectively. So a clean transportation standard could be devised however we'd like. It's the program we're crafting this program from the ground up, and so we can. There are incentives that can be built into the program. So there's money that's being traded between these fuel producers, and surplus dollars can be invested. We can argue for their investment, and so one way we can benefit the zero emission vehicle transition would be to have additional revenue go towards charging infrastructure. Perhaps providing rebates to people who are charging from home. So those are different examples of benefiting zero emission vehicle transition through infrastructure. Another one could be specifically putting dollars in the hands of companies that are selling these vehicles. And so like sort of bolstering their status in the car market could help alleviate a lot of that competition with cheaper petroleum cars that they're competing with. And so there's a big balance there, that we need to we recognize that electric vehicle adoption needs to be rooted in equity. That we care about adoption, but not just for families that are more well off and for folks who have the means, but we want to make electric vehicle adoption something that can be across the board for all Illinoisans. And so we're talking about ways in these negotiations and how we can better distribute benefits from electrification to underserved communities. Just as 40 communities is one way they can be referred to from a federal perspective. And so there are a lot of advocates in the room that have been harping on the importance of, at the end, the end goal of this clean transportation standard ought to be, let's move us towards an electric future, which is really exciting.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. And I'm not sure if the audience is just like overwhelmed with all the information, or we were so clear in our descriptions that no questions are needed. Thanks, Ellen. Well, if y'all think of any questions after simmering on these thoughts, you can all feel free to email me at danny@ioenviro.org, and I will make sure to send questions to our presenters if there's something I can't add. But I do want to welcome you all to continue joining us on this series of environmental town halls. This is the first one of our 6 issue areas. In the following weeks, we will launch our other policy issue areas. There's a link to get the information. Our next one will be next Wednesday, November 12th, for our Conservation Open Space Town Hall, where we will hear our Chief Programs Officer Lindsay Keeney talk about the advocacy that she's doing with her team and the conservation side of things, and we'll be hearing from some of the policy experts there. So there's no other questions. Once again, thank you all for joining us tonight, and listening a little bit about what we're going to be doing in 2026 on transportation. And we will be eager to get your support in continuing to do this advocacy and ensure that we continue on this momentum and environmental and climate policy wins.
Thanks, Danny. Thanks all.